Everybody knew that Chris was going to be a star. I mean, he had an enormously powerful aura about him.
The only person in the world who could play Superman is Chris.
It's open, come in.
He was a movie star overnight, around the world.
I mean, it was absolutely a freak accident.
He said, I'm going to play these cards, and watch me, I'm going to play them really good.
Christopher Reeve, now on Biography.
By the time Christopher Reeve was 26, he had reached a level of success many actors only dream of. He gained international stardom portraying the legendary Man of Steel, Superman. He made his first Broadway appearance starring opposite Katharine Hepburn.
We all went up and met with Katharine Hepburn for this play she was doing, and Chris walked in.
Got it immediately, damn him. He really had a real light around him.
At the same time Chris was on Broadway, he was conquering female hearts all over America as a soap opera star on television.
I guess you can never forgive me for what I did to you.
Over the years, he tackled almost 150 theater roles and made 10 television movies. And he appeared in such highly regarded films as The Bostonians, Death Trap, and The Remains of the Day. By 1995, Chris Reeve had it all, including a beautiful wife and 3 wonderful children. But the life he loved so well would change that Memorial Day. During a riding competition in Culpeper, Virginia, Chris was thrown from his horse and broke his neck.
It was absolutely a freak accident. If I'd landed a little bit one way, I'd be dead. A little bit more the other way, I would have walked away from it.
Christopher had the most severe injury at the highest level possible. He had what is called a complete spinal cord injury, where the spinal cord exits the brain.
Once I got past the regret, there was time to say, okay, here's the hand you've been dealt. Now what are we going to do with it?
Hi everybody, how you doing?
What Chris has done with it is extraordinary.
He put a face to spinal cord injury for the first time for the American public. And he showed such courage when he did that, that everybody's hearts opened up to him.
He gave something to those with spinal cord injuries that they had never had before.
He said the first thing was hope. Everything else followed.
Nurturing that hope required money, and by the spring of 2004, Chris's foundation had raised $47 million. Dollars that fund cutting-edge research to find a cure for spinal cord injuries.
I think he has inspired a generation of scientists to work very, very hard. And we're closer to getting therapies for people than ever before.
And for Chris and his wife Dana, it's not only about the cure, it's also about care. Their foundation provides quality of life grants that help people who are paralyzed.
Whether it's brain trauma or stroke or MS or ALS, we cover anything to do with paralysis. So it's not just spinal cord injury. That affects 8 million Americans.
What's wonderful is that Chris is strong enough to be able to rise above a really tragic situation and is able to find the good and carry on.
Christopher Reeve was born in New York City on September 25, 1952. The first child of Barbara and Franklin Reeve.
My mother was only 20 when I was born, and my father was 24. He was a Russian scholar, a translator, and also a poet, a novelist. He taught first at Columbia and then at Yale and at Wesleyan.
A year later, Chris's brother Benjamin followed. But when Chris was 4, his parents divorced, and his mother moved the boys to Princeton, New Jersey. Both parents remarried and had more children. But his parents' divorce was bitter, and Chris spent his childhood shuttling back and forth between the 2 households, learning to cope with life in his own way.
He was earnest. I mean, that word just keeps coming over and over again. And he was always a little bit older. When he was 5, he was 5 going on 8 or more.
I think that I wanted to be a grown-up, to sort of get my childhood past me, to have real independence to go out on my own.
An avid reader, Chris devoured books on his childhood heroes, Harry Houdini and Charles Lindbergh.
I think you only need to take Psych 101 to figure out where you're going with that. Escape and flight,
From early on, he found his escape on the stage. At Princeton Day School, he appeared in class plays, even while excelling in both academics and sports. When he was in 4th grade, Chris was cast as a chorus member in a production of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta at Princeton's professional theater, the McCarter. The show changed his life.
That was a big wow for him. And I really think the seeds of wanting to go on the stage go back to when he was 9 in that production.
The key to unlocking your imagination by being in the theater, that was really important in shaping me.
The prestigious Summer Theater in Williamstown, Massachusetts, offered Chris an apprenticeship when he was only 15.
But I thought I was 25, I really, and I thought I was an adult, and I could, sort of hang in there with the best of them.
I think the stage became a neutral ground for him, a place where he could be neither what he thought his mother expected him to be, nor what his father expected him to be. It was a place where he could be himself.
After graduating from high school, Chris headed for Cornell University, located in upstate New York.
I went to Cornell because it gets snowed in from October to May, and you have to study. And you won't be distracted by going down to New York looking for work. So what I did is every spring I'd go down to New York and audition for a summer job.
Those summer jobs included working at the San Diego Shakespeare Festival and going on tour. But even during college semesters, he spent a lot of time away from Cornell.
I think it was his sophomore or his junior year, he said, "I'd like to go and tour French and English repertory theaters, and I'll write you a paper, and perhaps that could count."
By his senior year of college, Chris was ready to move on. He applied to the Juilliard School in New York, a school known for its first-class drama faculty and its tough admission policies. He was one of several advanced students admitted in 1973.
Chris was promising not only because he was talented, but he was very tall, very imposing, quite handsome, with a tremendously good voice, and certainly somebody who had presence and clearly had a career ahead of him.
That fall, Chris began studying at Juilliard.
Chris came in and everybody was just terribly jealous of him and threatened by him. All the girls thought he was gorgeous, which he was. I mean, he looked like he walked right out of Mount Rushmore.
Chris and Stanley Wilson became close friends. That friendship soon grew to include another student, Robin Williams.
Robin was, from Mars, and I was a hippie from Texas, and we were much more outwardly insane than Chris, but we had a great time because we kind of complemented each other nicely.
To pay for his second year at Juilliard, Chris took a role in the soap opera Love of Life. He played the duplicitous Ben Harper, a bigamist.
I guess you can never forgive me for what I did to you.
And I have.
The dialogue, the writing is not always absolutely incredible, you know what I mean? So every day is a challenge to try to make it natural and bring it to life, and also to make the transition from being on stage to being on camera.
His character of Ben Harper became so popular with viewers that the producers increased Chris's role. Soon he found he could no longer keep up with the demands of his busy life.
He had to choose between doing the soap opera and making some nice money and getting some camera training or going back for his last year at school. He took the soap.
With the income from the soap, Chris was able to pursue another lifelong passion, his love of flying.
When I was in my stroller, I would get whiplash from looking at the planes going overhead. I've always been fascinated with flying.
Earning his pilot's license at 21, Chris spent many hours in the air. He shared his enthusiasm with another friend from acting class.
It was very quickly afterwards that we became very good friends, had the same interests. Both of us had a very passionate interest in aviation.
Chris's passionate interest in his career was paying off as well. In 1975, even as he appeared on Love of Life, he won his first role on Broadway, playing the grandson of Katharine Hepburn in A Matter of Gravity. But Chris almost didn't get past the audition.
Miss Hepburn and the producer Robert Whitehead were out in the audience, out in the dark, and I said, Miss Hepburn, before I began, I'm sure my grandmother, Beatrice Lamb, would like to be remembered to you. Of course, you remember that you were classmates at Bryn Mawr, and there was this silence. And then I hear from the auditorium, "Oh, Bea, I never could stand her."
Even so, they hired him on the spot, and Chris ended up learning a lot about acting from his legendary co-star.
The magic of Katharine Hepburn, at least in part, was that she never did the obvious. Often she would laugh when you'd expect her to cry, and vice versa, look away when you expect her to make contact, and she would change things from performance to performance. And I picked up that habit as well.
In 1976, Christopher Reeve had already made his Broadway debut. That same year, he went to Hollywood and won a small role in a submarine disaster movie called Gray Lady Down. Chris would later call the film a disaster about a disaster. Soon he was back in New York, appearing in an off-Broadway production, My Life. His co-stars were two other young up-and-coming actors.
So there was me and Chris and Jeff Daniels in this really tiny dressing room. Chris, he's got very wide shoulders, and he couldn't get in the door if he walked straight. He had to kind of turn his shoulders to get in.
While appearing in the play, Christopher Reeve's destiny was being shaped elsewhere. For several years, producers Ilya and Alexander Salkin had been planning a big-budget film of Superman. They were looking for just the right actor to bring the comic book hero to life. Chris first heard about the project from his actor friends Stanley Wilson and Michael O'Keefe.
Michael wanted to play Jimmy Olsen, and Chris and I both laughed and said, "Well, you're perfect. You should go get the role." And I wonder who they'll get as Superman, you know. And Chris didn't even mention it. I don't think it was even an inkling in him at that point that he might in fact play Superman.
But much to his surprise, Chris won the part, hands down.
What happened was this guy, it was Superman walked into the room. He stepped off the page of that comic book.
The filmmakers asked Chris to fly to London for a series of screen tests, but he wasn't ready to give up his role off-Broadway in My Life. So Chris flew to London on the weekends and returned home to New York to perform the play 8 times a week.
He would come back in and I would help him with his lines. And in between helping him with learning the lines and the scenes, I would try to convince him not to do it. Because I thought, I just didn't think it was the best idea.
We were flying one day, and he turned to me and he said, I'm up for the part of Superman, this big adventure film, and I'm thinking that I'm probably going to get it. I'm thinking of doing it. What do you think about that? And I said to him, I think it would probably ruin an actor's career.
But they had him put on the Clark Kent glasses, I found out later, and that got him the part. I mean, he was this guy.
So I went from making $75 a week off Broadway to suddenly making quite a lot more of that.
For the role of Superman, Chris was paid $250,000, a lot of money for an unknown. With filming set to begin in London, Chris left for England on a friend's private plane.
And I remember standing on the side of the runway there and crying because I just knew that he was going into a different realm, and he would very soon be earning a lot of money and gaining a lot of attention, and life was going to change for him.
The first change for Chris was his physique.
He was skinny back then. He was tall and beautiful, but definitely a string bean.
And then off he went to the gym and did, as Chris always does with everything he does, did it 100% and ended up with this gorgeous, gorgeous body.
Rising star Margot Kidder was cast as Lois Lane, the sidekick of Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent. For the two actors, it was hardly love at first sight.
When Chris and I first began working together, we were not enamored of each other. I mean, I was chaos. I would come charging into scenes not having planned anything, and I'd go with this and I'd go with that. Christopher would just be horrified at this out-of-control berserko person.
In several months, however, his relationship with his volatile co-star began to improve.
Then the brother-sister bickering turned into a real brother-sister relationship. We were strapped in those harnesses hanging from that ceiling for months on end, so we got really, really close. And I think that's what made it work on screen.
Oh, can I take you to the airport?
Not unless you can fly. Clark,
Ladies.
Sorry.
Change my clothes, thank you.
Well, hey, Lois, maybe we could... Lois?
Would you be a pet mail that for me, thanks?
Oh, sure. Night.
But the long hours and 18-month shooting schedule took their toll on Chris.
I think Chris was very lonely in London. Before he left, he would say, you know, I'm still going to be the same old Chris, you know, sneakers and dirty blue jeans. And I think when he got to London and everybody was addressing him as Superman and talking about him as Superman, he yearned for someone who knew him as Chris in the sneakers and the dirty blue jeans.
Chris's lonely days came to an end one day as he stood in line for lunch at the studio commissary. There, he met a London modeling executive named Gay Exton. Within months, the two were inseparable.
Gay was a very grounding force in his life at that point.
Gay Exton was she was a wonderful woman. She was a lot of fun, and they were a great pleasure to be with. And in those days, it was all, you know, it was parties.
As the opening of Superman approached in 1978, Christopher Reeve was nervous. His future depended on the success of the movie.
Chris was very apprehensive just before it opened. Why had he done this? And I came across the letter that I wrote to him, you know, reminding him about why he had done it and that it was a good thing, you know, and to think about it in those terms.
As it turned out, Chris had nothing to worry about. When Superman opened in December of 1978, it was a smash hit. Critics pointed to his performance as one of the major reasons for the film's success.
First of all, physically, there's a kind of dash, that kind of matinee idol, Errol Flynn quality that you never sense that this guy was straining to pull off a stunt.
He's definitely coming, Mr. Luthor. It's open. Come in.
In portraying the role, Chris tried to play down Superman's heroic aspect.
He's in a different solar system with a yellow sun, as opposed to the red sun of Krypton. So that's what gives him his powers. So it's not as though he'd earned them. You know, they just sort of came for free. And that to me was the key to playing him with humility. To play him pretty offhand, pretty casual. To play him as a friend rather than a one-man police force.
His interpretation of Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, also drew praise.
I mean, he really played sort of Cary Grant in Bringing Up Baby as Clark Kent, and it was a marvelous performance.
With Superman's release, Christopher Reeve became an international superstar overnight.
He never skipped a beat. He never, for a second, lost his central notion of himself as an actor.
I used to live in a 5th floor walk-up, and Warner Brothers would start sending limousines. And some of my out-of-work actor friends live on the same block. And out of sheer embarrassment, I used to ask the limo to wait around the corner, and I would sort of come out, sneak up the street, and get in a limo and drive away. One day, an actor friend caught me doing that, and he says, "You hypocrite. Don't you think we're happy for you? Get in a limousine and drive away and do it for us, okay?" And I knew that it was okay to go ahead and be famous.
But after Superman, Chris didn't want to be typecast as an action hero.
We talked to Sean Connery about it and asked Sean what he should do, and Sean said you should play every single possible part you can to distance yourself from this.
So for his first film outing after Superman, he chose Somewhere in Time, a turn-of-the-century romance co-starring Jane Seymour. He had a wonderful time making the movie on an island in Lake Michigan, but when the film opened, it bombed. He was having better luck, though, in his personal life. In December 1979, Chris and Gay Exton welcomed a son, Matthew. But even though Chris was elated with his new child, he was in no hurry to tie the knot.
For years, I had just been absolutely gun-shy. I thought the marriage was, gosh, you know, you sign a piece of paper and then you're locked up forever. It's like, you know, why shut yourself in?
Give me one of the brooms, quick!
In 1980, Chris returned to Williamstown, Massachusetts, and to the same theater where he had once served as an apprentice. Working at the small summer theater was quite a change of pace for the international superstar.
Here I can disappear into the ensemble, which is getting back to the basics of when I first started to learn to act, and I find that very necessary.
Now, Chris could use his celebrity to draw attention to the issues he supported. He threw his weight behind such organizations as the Special Olympics.
The time when I really found out about Superman was when I met all the participants and the coaches and the athletes of Special Olympics, and I realized that they are the Superman.
In 1981, Chris starred in Superman 2. He also returned to the Broadway stage in 5th of July, playing a Vietnam veteran who is a double amputee. The play went on to receive 5 Tony Award nominations. His Broadway success was followed by the movie version of Death Trap. Co-starring with Michael Caine, Chris played a young psychopath.
One of the things about Chris, and this may sound counter to the hero thing, but he's a great villain. He was a great villain in Death Trap, you know.
I've always believed that an actor should never judge the character that he's playing. That allows you to play somebody evil or somebody with values that aren't the same as yours, and it really frees you as an actor.
By 1983, 31-year-old Christopher Reeve was already firmly established in his movie career. He also had something to celebrate in his personal life, the birth of daughter Alexandra with Gay Exton. That summer, Chris took a substantial pay cut to appear with Vanessa Redgrave and Madeline Potter in the Merchant Ivory film The Bostonians. The script was just too good for him to pass up.
What I liked about it is the character I played, Basil Ransom, is morally ambiguous. The audience shouldn't know at the end of the film whether he is a knight in shining armor who rescues a young woman from a very arid kind of life, or whether he's an absolute spoiler who is basically a chauvinist pig.
It's just your sweet nature. You always wanted to please someone, Miss Chancellor, your parents, whoever else is dear to you. But it's not really you. You're meant for something different. You're meant for privacy. You're meant for love. For me.
Producer Ismael Merchant made The Bostonians on a shoestring budget.
Sometimes, actually, they ran short of cash, and when that happened, Ismael Merchant would go in the kitchen and whip up a big curry dinner for everybody. And I remember after a while, the crew printed up T-shirts. They said, "I did it for curry."
Art imitated life when Chris was cast in another film called The Aviator. The producers were in for quite a surprise when they learned that Chris was a licensed glider pilot, capable of doing his own flying. Flying was just another example of Chris Reeve's ability to excel in any sport he took up.
Chris has always taken whatever sport it is, whether we're playing water volleyball out in Marina del Rey back in the 70s, to flying, to sailing, to skiing. He absolutely takes it to the hilt. So he's really testing himself against the elements, if you think about it.
By this time, Chris's career was also being tested. In 1986, he starred in Street Smart, playing an unscrupulous magazine writer who meets a pimp in the course of his work. The pimp was played by a then unknown Morgan Freeman. But when Street Smart opened, it did more for Freeman's career than it did for Chris's.
Street Smart was a wildly underrated performance simply because not many people saw that film. Morgan Freeman was up for an Academy Award for it.
Street Smart was financed by Cannon Films, the company that had bought the rights for Superman, on the condition that Chris do Superman 4. But when Superman 4 was released in 1987, it failed, striking a blow to his career.
He suddenly wasn't up on the A+ list of actors. That's very tough when you've had that much worldwide fame to deal with.
At the same time, Chris's 10-year relationship with Gay Exton ended in 1987. They had never married, and the split was amicable. Chris stayed in America, and Gay returned to London with the 2 children.
Chris insisted on joint custody, which is kind of remarkable when you think that there's a whole ocean between them and 2 different cultures.
With romance the last thing from his mind, Chris returned to Williamstown in the summer of 1987. One evening, as he sat in the audience of the theater's cabaret, one of the performers caught his eye. Her name was Dana Morosini. He was captivated by her.
Not love at first sight, intense fascination and attraction at first sight.
It developed very quickly into real love.
We always thought, will Chris ever settle down? That kind of thing, you say. And then he met Dana, and suddenly he was another guy. I mean, they were smitten with each other.
6 months later, they were living together. But soon after, in the fall of 1987, a plea for help put him in the middle of a dangerous situation in South America. Chile's right-wing dictator, Augusto Pinochet, had threatened some 70 dissident artists, directors, and performers with execution.
And I remember calling up going, Chris, look, I think you can save lives for real this time here.
A few days before the deadline for the execution, Chris went down to Santiago, Chile, and took part in a demonstration with the protesters.
This was an act of salvation for Chilean artists, because if Chris had not gone down, I think some of them would have been killed.
The international attention Chris focused on the regime worked. The death warrants were lifted.
When Chris came back, he was moved in the sense like an earthquake moves you. He said they had been 2 or 3 of the most important days of his life.
Several years later, Chris translated that experience into political action at home. In 1989, he formed the Creative Coalition with Ron Silver, Susan Sarandon, and a number of others.
The idea was to educate public figures, meaning ourselves as well, that we needed to learn the issues in order to be able to communicate effectively with the media, and then to go and speak about the issues.
One of their toughest battles was waged in 1990, when Senator Jesse Helms wanted to get rid of the National Endowment for the Arts.
The arts are not a luxury. It's not something we indulge ourselves in to make ourselves feel better. It is more than that. It is practical business. It makes sense.
We managed to garner enough support and to make ourselves heard, and we're at least partially credited with saving the NEA from going out of business.
And Chris took a big step in his personal life when he married Dana on April 11th, 1992.
We were having dinner together in our apartment, and remember, right during dinner, we just kind of both turned to each other and said, we need to get married. It's time to get married, and actually we didn't finish dinner.
Their son Will was born 2 months later. Chris's personal growth also informed his work. His supporting role in The Remains of the Day in 1993 revealed a seasoned actor able to hold his own with such consummate performers as Emma Thompson and Anthony Hopkins.
Former housekeeper, at present living in Clevedon, has indicated to me, sir, that she might be prepared to return to service.
What's this, your girlfriend? Or you mean a former attachment?
Oh, no, sir, no, sir. No, but very able housekeeper, sir. Most able housekeeper.
I was just kidding, Stevens.
Yes, sir?
Sorry.
That was one of the few films where I didn't watch with my hands over my eyes. I actually said, well, that's pretty good.
Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome now one of our key final entries. Here is entry number 103, it's Christopher Reeve.
In the 90s, Chris began to take another of his interests more seriously, competitive horseback riding. He had started riding in 1984 and had become an experienced equestrian.
It's a sport that rewards patience, perseverance, understanding, you know, rather than a lot of the traditional kind of male sports which are based on aggression and hitting and kind of conquering.
On Memorial Day weekend, 1995, Chris headed for Culpeper, Virginia to compete in an equestrian event. It was a decision he had made at the last minute.
It was a sort of a toss-up between doing that or going to an event up in Vermont or going sailing. But a couple of days before the event, a whole group from the barn where I trained had decided to go down to Culpeper together, and I was convinced to go with everybody.
He's a good boy.
On Memorial Day weekend, 1995, Christopher Reeve was in Culpeper, Virginia for a jumping competition in Commonwealth Park. Saturday, May 27th began well. However, as he galloped toward the third jump, his horse, Buck, suddenly stopped short, and Chris was thrown from his horse.
I came straight down on the top rail of the jump, hyperextended my neck, and slumped down in a heap. Head first, 6 feet 4 inches and 215 pounds of me, straight down on the rail. Within seconds, I was paralyzed and not breathing.
Medics rushed Chris by helicopter to the University of Virginia Medical Center in Charlottesville, where doctors battled frantically to save his life.
Mr. Reeve currently has no movement or spontaneous respiration. He may require surgery to stabilize the upper spine in the near future.
Chris had broken the first and second vertebrae in his neck, damaging his spinal cord. He was paralyzed and unable to breathe without a respirator. He nearly lost all hope, but his wife, Dana, had hope enough for both of them.
And then I mouthed my first lucid words to her. Maybe we should let me go. Dana started crying. She said, I'm only going to say this once. I will support whatever you want to do because this is your life and your decision. And then she added the words that saved my life. You're still you, and I love you.
Chris is a man blessed with an extraordinary inner strength. He's a fighter and a survivor of the First Order. But this has to be the toughest challenge that he's ever faced. I know it's mine.
After 10 days in intensive care, Chris endured extremely risky surgery to reattach his skull to his spinal cord.
We're encouraged by the fact that he's moving his right trapezius voluntarily. He also has some movement on the left side.
By the end of June, he was out of immediate danger. After a month in the hospital, Chris transferred to Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation in New Jersey. There, he began an intensive exercise program, drawing on the same qualities that had helped him in his acting career.
There is an enormously new focus in Chris, a kind of, when you sit and talk to him, if you've known him before and you know him now, he is so there. He's so there that it's quite extraordinary. It's almost intimidating.
On October 16, 1995, after more than 3 months at Kessler, he made his first public appearance since the accident. He went to New York City to attend a fundraiser for the Creative Coalition. He was there to present an award to his longtime friend, Robin Williams. Many of his friends were moved by his courage.
I think it'll be good to see Chris again. I've seen him in the hospital. I think he's doing really well and very courageous.
He had met his first test. Once back at Kessler, Chris took on another new challenge. To help build up his breathing, he increased the amount of time spent off his ventilator. After 5.5 months at Kessler, in December 1995, Chris was finally ready to go home and begin the second part of his life. He dedicated himself to finding a cure for spinal cord injuries.
He was determined to do something about it. What he wanted to know was how.
Hello?
He said, well, will there be therapies that will restore function to people? I said, yes, if we're lucky, if we worked very hard, and we had all the resources that we needed.
So he and Dana set up the Christopher Reeve Paralysis Foundation.
It's part of my obligation, I believe, to help push the public and the private sector to work together to make the funding happen, to keep the research scientists doing their job.
I don't know of anybody else in or out of a wheelchair who works as hard for the cure as Christopher has.
Chris began traveling regularly, making speeches and lobbying Congress to get more funding for spinal cord injury research.
There's a tremendous amount of good science that is not being funded, and the work is not being done. But it has been discovered that regeneration is possible in the central nervous system, and that's about as big a finding as the invention of the wheel.
He believed that with human trials for nerve regeneration just a few years away, he would walk again. He began talking about it publicly.
Then I'll get incremental recovery, breathing, use of my arms, and then legs, and then eventually up to walking.
In the spring of 1996, Chris faced the one-year anniversary of his tragic accident with optimism. He invited friends to his home for a party.
And we planted a tree out in the backyard and had a little ceremony of hope and affirmation about the future rather than dwelling on the past.
There's always going to be turns. We had hopes for how our life was going to go. It didn't go like we planned at all. So we've adjusted. You know, now we're on this road and we have hopes on this road.
By 1996, Christopher Reeve had spent a year trying to adjust to his devastating injury. But in spite of his paralysis, he was eager to get back to work. So Chris decided to do something he had never done before. He wanted to direct. For his directorial debut, Chris chose a drama for HBO called In the Gloaming, starring Glenn Close and Robert Sean Leonard. It tells the story of a family with a son dying of AIDS.
It was the ideal first directing project for me. It was very self-contained. All takes place in one house, one location. And it's really what matters is performance. Trying to give the actors the space to, you know, for them to spread their wings and fly.
Don't tell me you're finally asking me about my sex life.
No, I'm asking about your love life.
Oh, my love life.
No, I'm serious. Did you love? Were you loved in return?
Yes.
Good.
Chris received an Emmy nomination for his directing.
I was very, very proud of how generous everyone was and how everybody pulled together to make it happen, to make it easy. So I didn't really have to do much except just enjoy. Just watch and then say, print.
And action.
He also returned to acting. He appeared in a TV movie called A Step Toward Tomorrow and starred in a television remake of Rear Window.
Hello.
In 1997, Chris also experienced a change in his own condition. He regained some feeling at the base of his spine.
I feel all the way down my left leg, so that when I got 2 blood clots in a row, my left leg was excruciating pain. Sometimes pain is good.
In 1998, Chris chronicled his story of spirit and determination in his best-selling autobiography, Still Me.
Which is, I think, a wonderful title. And I think this was the most important effect of Christopher on people, that they treat people with spinal cord injury as people, as still them.
To help them, Chris and his wife opened the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Resource Center in Short Hills, New Jersey. It provides information on everything from travel to the latest in research for those suffering from paralysis.
Whether it happened yesterday or 20 years ago. And you can go online to paralysis.org and information specialists will help you. And I'm very proud of that because when I was injured, we had nowhere to turn.
In November of 2000, Chris saw another sign of progress in his condition.
And I was sitting in my office with Dana, and my index finger, my left index finger, began to move. And she said, "Are you doing that on purpose?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, try." And so I looked at it, and I did. I tried, and I found, yeah, I could move it. And so I figured, if that can happen, well, who knows what else can happen? Let's go find out.
True to form, Christopher Reeve used his hard-earned gains to take on even more work. He appeared in the hit TV show Smallville and directed a number of projects, including the Brooke Ellison story, an A&E original movie about a young woman's brave struggle against paralysis.
The story, I think, will reach and impact more people than me giving 55 speeches. So I felt that both as a disabled person and as a filmmaker, that it would be the right thing to do to tell this story.
He's really good, and then, you know, couple that with the situation he's in, and then he becomes amazing. He becomes, in fact, Superman.
But what we hope you can learn from us and from each other is to take no one in your life for granted.
Given the parallels between our lives, he's very sensitive about what needs to be demonstrated in a situation like my own.
It feels important to me to try to make a contribution to raising awareness about spinal cord injury. I mean, just in very simple terms, for example, most people don't have any idea what it takes to end up sitting in a wheelchair in the morning, particularly when you have a severe injury and you're completely dependent on other people to do everything for you.
When the film completed production in July of 2004, Reeve continued to use his star power to raise public awareness of the issues paralytics face in everyday life and pressed lawmakers to lift a presidential ban on stem cell research. Unfortunately, Reeve would not live long enough to see the potential results of his tireless crusade.
Family, friends, and fans are mourning Christopher Reeve, the actor and medical research activist. Reeve died yesterday of complications from an infection at a hospital north of New York City. He was 52.
Reeve suffered a heart attack after developing an infection from a pressure wound, which is a common complication for people living with paralysis. His sudden death on October 10, 2004 is undeniably a loss. But Reeve leaves behind a legacy of hope for millions. He worked tirelessly throughout the last 9 years of his life, not only on his own personal progress, but for the causes that, without his effort, might never have gotten the attention they deserved. An advocate for advancement and a catalyst for change, he became an international symbol of courage. And while he may have played a superhero on screen, Christopher Reeve proved that you can be a bigger hero in real life.